Hello and welcome to Faith and Works, the podcast that takes a look at the happenings in the religious community in Metro Detroit. My name is Saeed Khan. I'm Associate Professor in Teaching of Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies and Director of Global Studies at Wayne State University. And I am joined by two illustrious guests here. We have Professor Jim Tubbs, who has a PhD in Religious Studies from the University of Virginia and is Adjunct Professor of Medical Ethics at the University of Detroit Mercy. Welcome, Jim Tubbs.
Thank you very much.
And we have Reverend Dr. Vic Clore, who has a PhD in Development Psychology from Wayne State University and is pastor of Christ the King Roman Catholic Parish in Detroit. He also holds an STL degree in Systematic Theology from Gregorian University in Rome, Italy. Welcome to the show, Reverend Vic.
Thank you.
So today we are talking about a very timely topic, and that is looking at a different angle of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it has to do with, broadly, medical exemptions based on religious grounds, a topic that, of course, is very pervasive, and we're finding that it is gaining more and more currency as people are seeking these for whatever might be their impetus, whether it is for ideological reasons, religious reasons, or perhaps even political reasons. But it opens up a series of opportunities and also challenges. When we look at, for example, the COVID-19 vaccine, which is really front and center in how this is being deployed, whether one can or should take it, what do religious communities and religious traditions have to say about such things as taking vaccines as opposed to a supposedly natural approach, let the body heal itself, and then whether it is required to have essentially a signing off by religious authorities in order to get a medical exemption. What about the whole idea of people exercising the term, I guess, is informed conscience, where perhaps they can then make the distinction or the decision on their own without necessarily going along with what their religious tradition has to say. A lot to unpack, and hopefully we will unpack that in this particular episode. So I'd like to start off by asking Reverend Vic, when it comes to the Catholic Church, what is the general consensus on the issue of medical exemptions, and particularly when it comes to seeking treatment? Is it something that, in the case particular, if you'd like to use the example of the COVID-19 vaccine, what have been some of the conversations going on, particularly among the clergy, in attitudes regarding whether to vaccinate or not, and what is the propriety of it?
In terms of medical interventions in general, the Catholic Church has been pretty much in favor of the science of medicine as part of a gift of God to just enhance human existence. In fact, up until 150 years ago or so, lots of doctors were actually priests. So the Church looked upon medicine, any kind of medical interventions or assistance, as a benefit that we all benefit from. So that's the general attitude. And so vaccinations would be included in that. So for years, I mean, even when I was a child, we got vaccinated and nobody ever asked, we got a smallpox vaccination. I can remember seeing adults who had survived smallpox with all the scars on their face, and my mother would tell me, well, that was a disease called smallpox. But remember when you got your vaccination and you had that little blister on your shoulder? That vaccinated you against smallpox. And then, of course, when polio came around, when I was 12, a friend of mine died of polio, and it was one of the first, probably the first time I went to a funeral where somebody of my own era had died. And so when we got a chance to get the polio vaccine, there wasn't any question. Those little sugar cubes that we dumped in, I think 3 times we had to do it. We didn't ask any questions about it. And there was never any discussion about it not being legitimate or moral because it's just part of medicine. So essentially, that's been pretty much the Catholic tradition. Vaccinations is the way to promote healing. So that's been our basic attitude.
Well, having visible a smallpox vaccine blister myself, it's comforting. I always found it almost a badge of honor to go ahead and have it, and it's remarkable how few people recognize that now, and you have to explain to them what is that thing on your arm. Jim, on the issue of hesitancy, clearly we're living in a different time now when the presumption of getting medical treatment was something that was left to the so-called experts. We're in a different position right now, where we seem as though we're in a different pathology now. I mean, pardon the pun. Where
I would agree with that.
Where the idea then of more of a defiance, more of an idea that we will not accept and we will not defer to the authority of science when it comes to these things. As Reverend Vic said, that you lined up, you had the Sabin vaccine for polio, took the sugar cube, tasted good, obviously tasted better than the Salk vaccine and the shot. It was going to hurt if you had a particular vaccine, whether it was cholera or tetanus, but you took it because you were taught to presume to believe in it. What's happened now?
Well, I think it's very unfortunate that the pandemic that we're now facing emerged at a time when there was simply great distrust between different political factions in the U.S. and elsewhere as well, but especially here. And what that led to was a distrust of the evidence that one group might be bringing forward, and in this case it happened to be scientific evidence about what we need, what's good for us, what is conducive to health. It's obviously not the first time in history that people have had other ideas about, well, what was the kind of health we should be seeking. When Cotton Mather, the Puritan preacher who had some very unfortunate views on witchcraft, but some more progressive views on other things in 1721, was convinced that variolation at that time, which was actually infecting people with a minor form of smallpox so that they could be immune from that, was the way to go in terms of health. He was fighting a lot of Puritan views about what was our acceptable involvement in our own bodies versus what we should be expecting God to do for us. He basically made the claim that the knowledge that allows us to get this data, and he was interested in getting data and using it, that intelligence itself was a gift from God, and he was sort of splitting off from Puritan theology at that point. The views that he was fighting in Boston at that time, which got his house firebombed almost, were largely from people whose religious views were such that it was a sin to defile the body by doing artificial things to it when it was really God's responsibility to intervene and heal you if that was going to happen. We still hear some of that argument today among those who are trying to make or declare religious exemptions or seek religious exemptions.
But having that kind of absolutism, I mean, I'd imagine that even in the 18th century, cesarean deliveries occurred. I mean, that seems as though it's a human intervention as opposed to the natural process of God allowing a baby to be birthed down the birth canal.
Yes.
I'm genuinely mystified that there was that kind of rigidity.
Well, and Mather himself pointed out that his accusers were people that would drink alcohol, which is a drug, and smoke tobacco, which is a drug, and intake various other things that were not natural in their bodies. So, yeah, it was a definitional fight then, just as it's become a definitional fight here, as well as a fight about what is acceptable knowledge. What is knowledge I will believe.
Was it a genuine intellectual and ideological difference of opinion, or was there something else? Was this a kind of ideological turf war that people just were trying to have their space within the broader discourse?
Oh, I think it may be more that now than it was then. Okay. I think there was genuine belief in the Puritan community that we are not puppets, but we are totally in God's hands. The idea that God would intervene in human history to do things that God wanted done was widely accepted. So that made suspicious artificial alternatives to that.
Okay. We've seen Reverend Vic, I mean, especially in the Catholic Church, history towards science at certain points have been less than collinear. I think Galileo probably would have said amen to that one.
He's exonerated about 100, 200, 350 years later.
Just a little late.
That's really looking at the wine glass half full. But the idea that there has been, within the very long and storied history of the Church, some moments where science has been viewed with a certain level of skepticism. Do you see that as being a reason or a rationale why there is skepticism among some Catholics today? To say, well, how much can we really put faith in science when even the Church has had a difficult relationship with it in the past?
In terms of the current discussion with the vaccine against COVID, I don't think that's coming to people's minds. I frankly don't think this is really a historical, theological issue in that regard. So you're right. The Church has frequently taken its time to recognize scientific interventions. And it is interesting that eventually there gets to be some exoneration. Teilhard de Chardin would be an example of a scientist who wasn't able to publish his works. All the while he was examining specimens in Asia, he was saying Mass every day as a priest. And it wasn't until after he died that finally we begrudgingly say, well, yeah, he did have some good ideas. So the notion of evolution is just kind of gradually becoming acceptable. What has happened in the current discussion is that they've discovered that the vaccine has some relationship with a cell strain that comes from an aborted fetus. And so that suddenly raises people's anxiety. And that kind of confused the issue in terms of the teaching church. So it took quite a while for finally get all the way to the Pope, and the Pope say, no, vaccinations are important. If nothing else, in charity to everybody else, we should get vaccinated. And he even makes the allowance that even if there is a connection to the cell line of aborted fetus, that the good outweighs that particular problem. Frankly, I don't hear the bishops using what they ought to consider more carefully, the whole notion of cooperation with evil. There's formal cooperation where you are not really doing the evil. For example, you're the getaway driver for a bank robbery. You didn't technically rob the bank, but you're driving the car to get the robbers there and get them away. So you are in formal cooperation with that bank robbery. If your friend asks you to borrow your car, and he's done that before, and you don't have any questions, and you're not going to pry into his business, and he robs a bank using your car, that's called material cooperation because he did use your car. So you, in that sense, have a relationship. You got a connection to that evil, but it's just a proximate connection. You're really not guilty of the crime. If you don't even know that he borrowed your car, he stole it, or just drove away with it without asking you, that's even more remote cooperation, material cooperation. Well, the issue of the cell line is a matter of material cooperation, and it's actually quite remote. So that should have immediately have been processed right off the bat. And then people would simply say, well, nobody's doing an abortion right now to create this vaccine. That would be formal cooperation. But this cell line has been in use for science for years. Now, granted, the bishops have a point that we should pressure the scientific world to find more legitimate ways to get a cell line, and maybe we don't need to depend on that particular cell line. But that's another issue. That's a kind of a broader sense of moral dignity that we would promote. But it doesn't have anything to do with the morality of having a vaccine. So unfortunately, that prevented the bishops from rather quickly simply making the logical conclusion that this is definitely a benefit to prevent people from getting the disease and to prevent people from spreading it. Finally, after much discussion, they have come to the point that, yes, you should get the vaccine. But, of course, some bishops will still warn you, try not to get the Johnson & Johnson because there was a closer connection to that one cell line. At first, you couldn't depend on what vaccine you got. Now, it is becoming easier to ask. You can ask for which vaccine you want. But that kind of muddied the waters and allowed a lot of people to have other motives for protesting the vaccine, including political motives. They had a lot of leeway to do that because of this kind of hesitancy to come right out quickly and promote the fact, yes, this is a vaccine. It's something that we should all do.
It's fascinating to see the parallels within the Catholic debate on this and even the Islamic debate, particularly when it comes to the embryonic stem cell lines. Some Islamic scholars have, in fact, been hesitant to give sanction to that for the very same reasons, and particularly more so than even clerics, individuals, perhaps under this notion of informed conscience, then rejecting, if it's even offered, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine in this case, because of their fear that it is tainted. They don't want to normalize it. They don't want to give sanction, or worse, legitimize it to the point where, as you had said, those new embryonic lines could be formed. Another debate where some of the vaccines have come under scrutiny is whether they are prepared in a gelatin medium and whether it is pork gelatin. And we're really getting into the microbiological at that point. I mean, on the one hand, obviously with people with a sincerely held belief in Islam, pork products are forbidden. At the same point, there are others who might say, well, those cells never oinked. So is it too attenuated, or is it still enough that it came from a pig? So again, it seems that obviously the Catholic Church is not doesn't hold a monopoly on these kinds of deliberations. Jim, you'd mentioned about how things have changed now since cotton got firebombed back, I guess that would be 300 years now ago. I don't know if anyone's holding an anniversary for that in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. But this idea that something has obviously changed, and it doesn't have to even be looking back 300 years. We can even dismiss that as saying, well, that was so 300 years ago. But the fact that even within our lifetimes, I would imagine the attitudes toward vaccines and the deference given to medical science seems to now have received a rupture. Where do you see that turn happening, and why do you think it happened?
Well, I mean, from my own point of view, it's largely political and ideological. One of the things I've been looking at recently is the reports about religious exemptions that people seek, because when people are actually asked to specify what their religious aversion is, oftentimes the answers get political, or it is simply a refusal to believe the information that they're given. And those are things that are not necessarily religious, but they're kind of mixed up. I noticed I think it was Rhode Island, when Rhode Island got rid of its religious exemption, got rid of its personal exemption, which Michigan still has, for parents to exempt their children from getting vaccines from school. When they got rid of that exemption, all of a sudden the people choosing a religious exemption went way up because it was the only one left, that they could seek. So it's hard to say. But of course, because of a couple of past Supreme Court doctrines and the EEOC's interpretation of those now, what a religious reason might look like is very, very broad. And they've even used the language, it can be an ethical or moral belief as long as it is sincerely held. So how to test that has become a very difficult thing. The kind of advice that lawyers are giving to employers, now that the Biden administration has required all companies with at least 100 employees to mandate the vaccine, the kind of advice that lawyers are giving about that is very interesting. I was very intrigued by one healthcare system in Iowa, I believe it was, because they were getting a lot of people who were not necessarily Catholic, but who said, I'm unwilling to partake in anything that has any remote connection to abortion. So they gave them a document that says, okay, we need to be sure that you're consistent in your belief. So you need to attest that you're not using any of these other things that were tested using cells from aborted fetuses. And they included things like Tylenol, ibuprofen, Benadryl, Claritin, Pepto-Bismol, Maalox, Sudafed, Zoloft, aspirin, Simvastatin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a long list of things. In fact, a great many medicines as well as most vaccines. So one of the ways in which the sincerity has been tested in some places is to say, okay, are you being consistent in avoiding all of these things that have some connection, at least in the past?
Well, I guess that means people are going to switch to medical marijuana in large numbers because I'm pretty sure that doesn't
involve aborted cells there.
There you go. Well, I mean, but in all seriousness, I mean, this whole idea then about when there is government action that's taken, and especially ones that have these cutoff lines, like say, I mean, what has to be seen as an arbitrary number, 100 employees, that then the vaccine mandate is triggered. An employer can simply say, well, I guess I'm going to have 99 employees, and then everybody else is an independent contractor, especially if there is enough of a groundswell among his workers or her workers to go ahead and oppose the vaccine mandate. So,
and there's a push now to try to decrease the number of employees that are covered.
And that is happening.
Yes.
So basically, if the mouse gets bigger, you build a bigger mousetrap, and then the mouse evolves as well.
That includes the possibility of a religious exemption. It has to under federal law. The question is, how do you structure that, and how do you test it in any way? You can ask people, okay, what is the basis for this? But, you mentioned earlier the Pope saying something. That does not matter anymore in terms of American law. One can sincerely hold a belief that is not taught by the faith that they profess to hold to. So it's just a matter of whether it is sincerely held or not, and how you measure or test that is a very, very rocky road.
Well, you also mentioned, I think before, this idea about sincerely held beliefs to religion. I guess we then have to go ahead and perhaps revisit how do we view religion. Mm-hmm. We find that there are those who are testing this quite effectively, including the Satanic Temple. They are very adept at understanding constitutional law, and one of the arguments that they have in fact made is that to be able to have an abortion is an exercise of their religious freedom. And it'll be interesting to see if that case goes up to the Supreme Court to essentially flip what the arguments are on the other side, to say that you are denying what is a sincerely held belief and for lack of better words, a dispensation in doing so. So there's a lot more constitutional law that I think that I think is out there. Reverend Vic, Jim of course mentioned the Pope, and I suppose once upon a time, and humor me, I mean I get it, it's not canonical, but there's a presumption that Catholics would defer to a papal pronouncement, or at least something, an encyclical or some other document coming out of the Vatican. And it seems as though, particularly on matters of now health, that may not necessarily be a presumption to be had. What does that say then about the relationship of authority, especially when somebody might be ironically seeking a medical exemption on religious grounds, which is not actually supported by the religious authority itself?
At least in our particular United States anyway, there's a whole drifting going on in terms of adulation of the Pope. Up until the last 10 or 15 years, Catholics were just, if the Pope said it, it's got to be true. But now people are finding reasons why Pope Francis, well, that's his opinion. And so even the way Pope Francis spoke this, it was not a formal document that he wrote. He just made that statement that it's out of charity, you ought to get vaccinated. So he himself was quite muted in the emphasis that he gave to it. Sadly, what is going on is that even in terms of church discernment through bishops and theologians and all the way to the Vatican, that's a whole process of exploring. It's kind of like a scientific method. Theology is a kind of science. It's a way of testing one's experience and making a judgment. Right now, there's more confusion, and it gets to be a matter of personality. And so if you don't like the Pope or don't like some of the things he does, then you can kind of discard anything he says. So sadly, that kind of thing is going on right now. And then this particular discussion gets hooked up into that as well.
But what happens, for the sake of argument, if a Catholic who has a sincerely held belief in Catholicism says that he or she wants a medical exemption on religious grounds, would the Catholic Church then have to intervene and say, actually, that's not what we believe? Is it going to come down to nullifying the argument that is being made by the person requesting the medical exemption on religious grounds?
The most the bishops have said is that we do want to honor the right of a well-formed conscience. Now, what is a well-formed conscience? So they really haven't gone much further than saying that everybody has to function on a well-formed conscience. Well, yeah, we've always said that. The issue then is what kind of formation have you gone through with your conscience to apply it to this situation? This is not the only example, but this is kind of the current one of kind of a confusion in people's minds as to what is the difference between a theological opinion or a pretty well a reasoned judgment that we all pretty much can recognize this is the truth and this is what we need to do. People are willing to take one's own personal opinion and call that a well-formed conscience. It really isn't. But if they can convince whatever authority, for example, police officers in Chicago are all protesting against the vaccine. Well, a lot of those guys are Catholic. That's just kind of illustrates the muddying of the waters, the confusion that is kind of emerging in the last few years in terms of what is Catholic teaching.
So the union president of the Chicago Police Union supersedes the Pope on this one.
Yeah, that's what's going on.
If he will provide support.
Yes, support
to what I already think.
Well, who holds the keys to getting the pension, right? But this idea then is, aren't we then hurtling away from religious authority to then the subjectivity of the individual? At what point then do we reach a tipping point that having the structuralism of a church is really no longer relevant if you now have one pope being replaced by 200 million little popes?
Yeah, the individual conscience has to function within society, within your group. So we really don't believe in absolute independence in terms of conscience. So the society, in this case the church, your religious society, they go through a processing of experiences and coming to reasonable judgments. And then the individuals are faced with making a decision. For the most part, the society has thought it through fairly well. So you can pretty much depend on that to be how you're going to govern your conscience. But it is true that any general law or rule is general, and there may be exceptions. So the individual person does have to decide, does this general policy apply in this particular situation? And that's what conscience means. Is killing a sin? Well, yes, of course. Well, what if a person's threatening you with a gun? Oh, well, that's different, So you kind of think it through. In this case, this particular basic rule, thou shalt not kill, doesn't apply if the person's trying to kill me. So then you kind of make your conscientious judgment in this particular situation. The whole notion of liberty, there's a lot of talk about the freedom of my body and that kind of thing. Liberty always has to be within a framework of what is good for the common good. So sometimes our personal liberty is curtailed by what is really needed by the common good.
Yeah, I think this concept of the common good, I know that in Islamic tradition it's called the maslahah, that the individual adherent has to recognize that even a religious obligation cannot allow for that person to be a libertine. This happens every Friday at the mosque when people double park because they're late going to prayer, and they feel emboldened to do so out of a sense of heightened indignation that I got to get in there because I got to pray because it's an obligation. And some poor schmo out there is doing the very same thing, praying inside, and needs to get back to work, but it really doesn't matter.
Even more basic than the notion of common good is the love of neighbor, because that's what's really at stake, and that's what the Pope was focusing on, trying to form consciences around the duties of charity that we have toward one another. I was really intrigued to see the official statement of the Christian Science Church on this, because they pretty much say, most of our adherents are people who believe that their approach to illness should be prayer. In this case, however, we all have duties to our neighbors, and for that reason, they believe that in terms of when it comes to vaccines, that while people should be free to make up their own minds about it, we nevertheless have a presumptive duty to obey the laws of the land and to cooperate with governmentally mandated vaccine programs as well. So they're recognizing that tension, too, between individual conscience and other kinds of responsibilities.
Sure, but now your neighbors may not be the people who live next to you. Your neighbors may be in the virtual world. And so this idea of a social obligation may be now tethered to who's part of your chat group, who's part of your I was going to say Facebook, but now it's Meta, friends group, that you don't feel that same kind of social obligation to be neighborly to the person who's next to you who watches your house to make sure that
maybe not, but when you could infect your own child, that's definitely
absolutely. So I'm struggling with a question here, Jim, and that is, as you're looking at medical exemptions on religious grounds, are all religions the same in America?
The answer is no, because in the first place, you would have a hard time defining what all religions in America are or look like. Nobody's done that.
Sure, and of course it doesn't help that we can't ask that question on the census, but, we do have the guidance of
sincerely held belief.
Of sincerely held belief, and let me just go ahead and give the disclaimer of being tongue-in-cheek here. The infallibility of the Supreme Court. I seem to recall a case back in, I think it was 1990, Employment Division versus Smith. The late and dearly departed Antonin Scalia, writing the opinion for this, about a Native American tribe that was using peyote as part of a religious ceremony. And there was a religiously neutral law, according to Scalia, that was applied across the board that didn't mention religion at all. And as a result of that, the idea of the free exercise of religion could not be invoked by this particular Native American tribe. We've come a long way from that with the deference now given to say not only can religion supersede a religiously neutral statute, but the fact that this can become a doorway or a gateway to the rather officious use of the medical exception on religious grounds. So, I mean, are we just all smoking peyote now ourselves?
I don't know. I think it will be intriguing to see where this goes. Of course, the Supreme Court has also distinguished between respecting religious observances and beliefs on the one hand and acts on the other, which may have effects on other people, which, of course, was the basis for throwing out polygamy. Well, even the EEOC guidance now for employers makes clear that you should do everything you can to respect the sincerely held religious beliefs of individuals and make accommodation for them as alternatives when you can, except when that is overly burdensome to the organization and its mission and what you're supposed to be there for. So that's the caveat. There's still a limit in terms of its burdensomeness to others. And I think with a vaccine, when you've seen examples of, particularly in a particular workplace, when you've already had examples of spread of that disease, and this one is very, very easy, the Delta variant especially, very easy to spread, then that kind of burden is something that is very front and center when it comes to addressing this as policy.
If you had to prognosticate, and looking at the Supreme Court right now, which direction do you see things going? Do you think that there's going to be greater deference given to these kinds of invocations of religion?
I'm not sure, because twice now the Supreme Court has refused to intervene with a group of healthcare professionals in Maine and also students in Indiana. Vaccine mandates have been upheld by the courts since 1905. So whether particular kinds of religious exceptions will get up that far, I don't know. I know there's certainly groups trying.
Well, I mean, they've tried in other capacities. I mean, we're talking about Colorado bakeries when it comes to refusing service to members of the LGBTQ community. So it seems as though there's a bit of a ratcheting up when it comes to the idea of pushing back on the misuse of, or what could be argued as the misuse of religion.
Well, this is maybe a catty thing to say, but one of their number on the Supreme Court has now been infected after being vaccinated. So that may have some influence on the way they look at one's freedom to avoid that kind of protection.
Yeah, where's Squee when you need him? Reverend Vic, I look at the Catholic Church, and I mean, I see it as being somewhat different from other religious traditions because of its structure, because of its long and storied history, and its pervasiveness around the world. Mm-hmm. Do you see other Catholic communities around the world positing similar objections, similar hesitancies when it comes to medical treatment? Or is this an American Catholic phenomenon?
That is a good question. I really haven't investigated that at all. My hunch is that it is a kind of a unique thing going on in the United States right now, so that our particular religious community in the United States is Catholic community is has different perspectives on things. So whether or not that's true, I think in a lot of other countries, probably it's a little more conformist, especially the more communitarian cultures. A lot of cultures are Catholic, and many of them are more stronger in terms of communitarian values, and so they would not be having this kind of confusion going on as much. Our particular experience seems to be especially in the last few years, it seems to be promoting kind of almost a divisive us against them type approach to public policy, probably for the last 20 years or more. So I think it's to some extent a unique thing that's combined with the immediate historical reality of the United States right now. And probably it's going to have to be resolved as we in the public realm come to a more humane approach to one another. Just today in Paul's reading that we read at liturgy, Paul says, "Stop looking down on one another. Stop judging one another." We should all be reading, that's Romans 14, I think, that Paul apparently was experiencing some problem in his own communities of people making judgments about each other that were not called for. So this is, it's not an unheard of problem. But I think it is more, right now it is kind of emerging to the surface in our particular society. That's politics as well as religion. We're going to have to work it out in a very broad, multifaceted way over the next few years.
Yeah, I was in Portugal in September. It was my first international trip since the lockdown. And there were certainly a lot of hoops through which I had to go to get into Portugal. I suppose in the grand scheme of things, having become somewhat acclimated to extra hoops in a post-9/11 world, it was relatively tame, but it required obviously a negative PCR test within 72 hours. It required documentation of full vaccination, and it required uploading information to a Portuguese Ministry of Health app in which you got a QR code. And that was just so that I could get my boarding pass in Detroit. And then on board the flight, I had to fill out a contact tracing form. And then also connecting through Amsterdam, a quarantine exemption form as to why the Dutch shouldn't go ahead and quarantine me. And then upon landing in Lisbon, before getting off the jetway into the terminal, having to show negative PCR test, full vaccination, and that QR code. But Portugal had somewhere along the lines of 90% full vaccination. And here is a predominantly Catholic country. And I asked my Uber driver, why aren't you at the full 100%? And he said, come on, give me a break. He said, in all seriousness, he says, well, we actually believe that we have 100% vaccination. And I said, no hesitancy, no defiance or anything like that. And he said something really interesting. He said, look, we had to live through Salazar, the fascist regime, which finally ended in 1974. And he says, we have a whole different attitude. For us, we saw this as having agency. We wanted to be vaccinated, and the one thing that really impeded us was the availability of the vaccine. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be a fairly common refrain in those places that maybe there's an appreciation that getting the vaccine meant that there should be no excuses, and let's go ahead and use it. But it was interesting to see that in the case of Portugal, as I said, a very Catholic country.
Yes.
Great food, by the way, great seafood. Looking at this from a standpoint of trajectory, where are we going with medical ethics when it comes to this current debate of medical exemptions and the kind of subjectivity of the individual knowing better than whether it is religious authorities or it is health authorities. I mean, it seems as though WebMD, maybe some presidents of police unions now hold sway over the informed conscience in a way that medical researchers, doctors, and clerics don't.
That's a very good question. I don't see a whole lot of advice giving about that yet. What I do see is that a suggestion that public authorities do need to hold people who are going to absent themselves from what is generally understood as a duty to protect not only themselves but their neighbors, that if they're going to do that for whatever they call religious reasons, they've got to be consistent as well as sincere in doing that, in holding that. Because I think we are sort of politically hamstrung by the fact that, we have courts that have never done what we would have a hard time doing either, and that is defining what a religion is and therefore what a religious belief about something can be. And so we're left with that as a problem. So until people can be convinced that they owe it to one another, as the Pope has tried to do, the only other relief valve is cutting off or abbreviating those exemptions.
You sound a bit more sanguine about this than I guess I am. That is this individualism going to reach a tipping point by which we no longer recognize where the railings are in a society, that everyone gets to go ahead and decide, and we become more and more balkanized. I think it was John Donne who said no man is an island, and it looks like everyone is really moving toward that.
I'm not that sanguine about that. Okay. The kind of individualism, I don't know, some days I feel like everybody I see on TV has been reading Ayn Rand. I don't know exactly how to respond to that, particularly within my own Christian faith community, because people who are claiming to be Christian are basically arguing not just for their own conscience to be dominant, but their own self-interest to be dominant.
Well, one of these dominant phrases these days is "I'm speaking my truth."
Right. Yeah.
So how is that? Well, how is that dislodged from?
That's postmodernism. And that was kind of predictable that postmodernism would lead to that sort of, if you can't really define some specific measure of something, then because everybody's sort of moving in their own paths, then it's going to be very difficult to come up with anything that everybody can agree on as fact to begin with. And I think we're sort of reaping the whirlwind of that. But the roots of it were there long ago.
Postmodernism came about with the disillusionment of the grand narrative of modernism. Mm-hmm. And it seems as though perhaps we've moved beyond postmodernism to this idea that we now no longer have to choose between two absolute truths or grand narratives. We've got 1.8 billion absolute truths. Wow, okay.
But I think postmodernism had that seed in it.
Sure.
In
today's parlance, it would be called a Horcrux.
Yes.
To borrow from
So you basically have to, just find a group of people that can actually agree to believe the same things you do.
So when we're talking about, Reverend Vic, getting a group of people to believe what you do, beyond the marketing element of it, which of course now can happen with anybody who's got a Twitter account, I suppose, how much is a quorum? The whole idea of collectives like the Catholic Church, like Islam, even a Protestant denomination or some others, there was still enough of a critical mass that people could say we've got enough of a collective, and also along that the consensus to have an authority to whom we can defer, instead of just sort of terrorizing the substitute teacher who doesn't know better, and we're going to go ahead and set the rules in the classroom while he or she is there. what does this then bode for the future of Catholicism? Which, I mean, obviously it's been dealing with some other meta issues like secularism, church attendance, and the such. How can the Catholic Church deal with the absence of a rudder of its own authority?
We are dealing with that. In one sense, the church is local. So the individual congregation is an assembly of church. Obviously, if you're going to call yourself a Catholic parish, then you have to have a affiliation with the Catholic structure. But your experience on a day-to-day basis for virtually everybody is what their particular parish church and what they hear on Sunday morning in their particular church. So that's an interesting feature that we're actually seeing emerge more of, and it's probably a good thing because it's less authoritarian and more communitarian to look on it that way. But so that's a very broad issue that ever since the Second Vatican Council we've been kind of exploring. How does that work? How do we really be church right where the people that I live with and talk to and meet every day? How do I see this as being a true manifestation of the larger church? So that's a question that we're facing more or less, given the local parish. Some parishes are still pretty authoritarian too. So how this is going to play out? This is you have to take a long range view of history, taking a look at this. We all have been pretty much aware that we've had a Vatican Council just over 50 years ago. Most people say it takes 100 years for the principles of a council to actually take root. So we're still nursing the little seedlings at this point. But that is where it's going in terms of really identifying the authentic local church as a participant in the broader church, and yet not having a necessarily identical configuration or opinion about things with one another, that there's some solidarity in principle, in general basis in Scripture and the basic teachings, but with some more freedom of individual application in your own community.
Could I add to that? I think there is also an affective I know that there is an affective side of religion that's not propositional. It's not just about knowledge. It's not just about belief, but it's about what I can sense, what I can feel. And I think that is something that can, over time, militate against the hyper-individualization within religious communities, because that is something that pulls people together, a shared sense of something.
Is that a morality?
Not necessarily. Sometimes it's simply an awareness of being welcomed, an awareness of being part of something that's much larger than yourself. And I would say that's kind of at the heart of most religious belief systems anyway. It's that sense of being a part of something larger than myself.
So again, we're looking at, and I think Reverend Vic, you alluded to this, the idea of the difference between religion at the local level and religion at the macro level, or let's say the global level. Is what we're seeing here now with these issues of medical exemptions, is this the inevitability of globalization and a pushback from the local saying, we don't want the level of abstraction to be that large, it's too big of a scale, we want to go ahead and bring it a little bit closer in?
I think it's in part a result of our communication technology, which I could blame a lot of things on that. But the very fact that people, no matter how bizarre their beliefs, can find others that think the same way and give them support through social media, through other means of electronic communication, makes this a playing field that's just got way too many individual small groups in it.
Well, and we saw that. I mean, the power of the one, the now discredited Scandinavian, I believe, researcher in quotation marks that talked about the link of vaccines to autism. And before you know it, it became like that shampoo commercial in the 70s and 80s.
And how many people knew it when the Lancet retracted the article and said this was all false?
Well, so, okay, I'm glad that you mentioned Lancet, because the notion of prestigious journals, which, of course, then were in their own way authoritative, and really in the 19th century one could argue as being the antithesis of religious authority. These were journals that if you wanted to, and probably would get tenure, you simply had to publish a paper that talked about eugenics or craniometry or other such scientifically profound ideas that, oh yes, it just so happens because religion or science don't lie, that the Teutonic people have larger skull capacity, therefore they have larger brains, therefore they have greater intelligence. Then, oh well, I guess science doesn't lie. The Hottentots and all kinds of other taxonomically challenged people within that. Is this seen now as a refutation of science by people invoking religion? Because as we were talking about before, it's having a ping-pong match with the grand narratives? Are we just on the other side of things?
I'm not sure I would go that far.
Oh, I'll take it that far.
I think it's more political than that.
Okay.
I think it's a historical happenstance that these things came together at the same time, because I saw and feared a genuine retreat to sort of militant individualism and don't tread on me before the pandemic came along. But it fell right into that way of dividing people.
So we're just in a perfect storm right now?
I think so.
Okay. So if we are indeed in a perfect storm, I'll ask this question, and we can, I think this would be a good place to end it for our audience. Looking forward when it comes to these debates about religion and medical science, is this a tension that can be reconciled, or is this going to be a Chernobyl moment where it implodes both the credibility of religious authority and at the same time the credibility of medical science?
Well, I don't think it's going to implode either one of those things. I think it will. I mean, we have the know-nothings in our history. This has happened before. I think it will work itself out. My fear is how violent on the periphery it can become as people goad one another on using social media. That would be my biggest concern at this point, because what's the old expression? A lie gets around the world 20 times before the truth can be heard. That's I think a big problem here, because until it's largely people's experience of knowing someone or admiring someone or trusting someone who provides a certain kind of information that allows them to accept that information. And until that all of us can remember when there were 3 nightly news networks, and when
I could even name you the anchors.
Yes, exactly. Huntley Brinkley, Walter Cronkite. Was it Eric Severide on ABC?
It was Eric Severide.
Yeah. If they said it, you figured it had to be vetted and it had to be okay. But with all of these alternative fact finders and fact presenters, I think we have to learn to live with that reality, and I'm not sure how that's going to happen. It could be an implosion. I hope it will not be.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by the pathology of a virus. It's non-living, and it's microscopic, and in many ways, it's like what we have to, I think, in your estimation, fear even more, and that's the algorithm on social media. Reverend Vic, I'll give you the last word on this. Where do you see things going?
Well, I think you've got your finger on it there, but all the while I've been involved in trying to figure out what is true. Like libraries, for example, the librarian can decide what really belongs in the library, and now there isn't that kind of thing. So the social media phenomenon that we're dealing with right now, you can, like the QAnon, people can see it there and propose this as true, and there's no way to vet that. You can't see where they're getting it from unless you try to trace it. You probably can't, and so that is an issue that we're all facing right now: is how we are communicating with one another through the social media. How are we going to be able to make the social media become a legitimate way of communicating truth and value and mutual support for one another and that kind of thing? So, we have our work cut out for us in that regard.
I remember a simpler time when John Lennon said, "I don't believe in Beatles, I just believe in me." I think we've come well beyond that.
Way too far.
way too far. I was just, of course, shocked when he told me that the walrus was Paul. So, talk about a revelation there. Well, listen, I want to thank both of our guests for joining us, Professor Jim Tubbs, Adjunct Professor of Medical Ethics at the University of Detroit Mercy, and Reverend Dr. Vic Clore, who is pastor of Christ the King Roman Catholic Parish here in Detroit. Thank you for joining us today for Faith and Works. I am Saeed Khan. Faith and Works is a production of the Interfaith Leadership Council of Metropolitan Detroit. We also want to thank bensound.com for the music Retro Soul used on this podcast. And until next time, thank you so much.